Now when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them. He said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock."
Good morning. How's everybody? So far, so good. I'm good also. Thank you for asking. I know it was in your hearts. So, the past few weeks leading up to this sermon, I did indicate that the abundant life has run its course, not in our lives, but the series. And I was going to be starting a new series today, and we are, and it's called Our Manifesto. It's on the Sermon on the Mount. This sermon series came to me back even before I began the process with this church, believe it or not, last summer, when I knew that God was going to be opening the door to somewhere. I began to seek him already at that time what he would have me preach on. And so the Sermon on the Mount was actually supposed to be the first series I was going to preach. And then I ended up obviously sharing about the abundant life, and I think that was God's providence as well. But so I say that to say, man, this goes back a little bit for me. And so I'm excited to share over these next handful of weeks with you as we begin the process of really walking through what is considered the most significant discourse in all the Bible. If not all the Bible, at least in the New Testament, in the Gospels, Jesus' most significant discourse. It's his lengthiest discourse, that's for sure. It's just over 2,000 words. And it's something that's been so important to the church that I would venture to say that most of you probably have read it, the Sermon on the Mount. You've probably heard it read. You've probably heard it preached. So you're familiar with it. And as we get into this morning's message on the Beatitudes, if you're sitting in your seat thinking, no, I don't know that I have. I'm not quite sure that I have. I think that as soon as I start presenting, you're going to be like, oh, yeah, I think I've heard that. I have heard that. That sounds familiar. Now, as most of you probably would figure it out yourselves just by guessing, if you guess this, you'd be right. Jesus didn't come up with that sermon title, or that sermon title. He's not like a pastor who was sitting thinking, what am I going to call this message? He didn't go up on the mountain and say, I'm going to call this a Sermon on the Mount. No, he just went up, sat down, and he preached. You know who else didn't name it the Sermon on the Mount? His disciples. It also wasn't named the Sermon on the Mount by his disciples. In fact, who's accredited with making that title most popular, whether he's the one that was the first to tag it that or not, is St. Augustine. It goes back to the 5th century, and he wrote, published a work, and he called it Our Lord's Sermon on the Mount. And so ever since then, it's been referred to as the Sermon on the Mount. So if he didn't come up with it, he at least popularized that name. Now, the great theme of this sermon is the kingdom of heaven. That's the great theme. If you were to Google search it, look online, and try to figure out what is the main theme, you would actually read about some other things: righteousness, holiness, the life that we're called to live. So lots of different things, but the main theme, the most consistent theme that you would come across is the kingdom of heaven. and the life that is the byproduct of that kingdom, which is, I'm going to call it the kingdom life, okay? That is, it's not just about talking about the spiritual kingdom, but there's a byproduct of that kingdom that should be seen in the life of the believer. For that reason, it's been said that the Sermon on the Mount is Jesus' closest teaching to a manifesto. We've all heard that word manifesto. Unfortunately, most of us have probably heard it for its bad implications. Oftentimes terrible things happen, people do terrible things, and they leave manifestos. And so a lot of us have heard of a manifesto simply because of that, but a manifesto isn't necessarily it's not a bad thing. And this Christian manifesto of ours that Jesus offered us contains some of the most central doctrines of the Christian faith. And so that's why it's been oftentimes referred to as that. You can actually do some research and you find there's been some books that have been written that have been entitled Christian Manifesto or Our Manifesto or The Manifesto. So this isn't my idea. As much as I want to take credit for it. So I came up with this manifesto idea. I didn't come up with the manifesto idea. But what it does teach us is, ultimately, it teaches us who we are to be. Or maybe a better way to say it is who we are to become. Now, Alistair Begg, if any of you are familiar with him, he's a pretty well-known pastor. I listen to him from time to time. I think he's probably offered the greatest 3-minute sermon clip in all of sermondom. When he preaches on the gospel for 3 minutes, there's this clip. You can look it up. It's pretty powerful. But Alistair Begg is a pastor I admire. He also has an accent. So if you're a pastor with an accent, you've already got a leg up. You've got a leg up on every pastor that doesn't have an accent. So, I was saying this morning to the first congregation, I wonder if I went to his country, if my accent would be compelling. Right? So I'd have a leg up on him there. I wonder about this. So if you guys ever want to send me, internationally to preach, just for some research, just to see if it's true, I'm happy to do it. Just let me know. But he's got a great accent and he's a great preacher. But when he talks about the Sermon on the Mount, one of the things that he said is that it identifies the marks of a true Christian. So if someone isn't living according to these or isn't becoming these things, that he'd question whether they're a true Christian or not. Now, manifesto, before we go too much further, I want to give you a definition for what manifesto means. It's a public written declaration that states someone's core beliefs, someone's core values, ideals, goals, objectives. It's almost always meant to inspire change by connecting its audience to a new vision. And if you've read the Sermon on the Mount, you're starting to think, okay, I think I see that. I think it makes sense to me. It's a mission statement. And it outlines principles and ideals that generally, it's because it's something new. It's generally presenting something new. It challenges the listener or the reader, if you happen to just be reading it. It challenges your comforts. It challenges your norms. So it's meant to stretch you because it's meant to take you to a new place, point you towards a different future. So the Sermon on the Mount, as you read it, you sense it and you see it that it communicates a charge, that the Sermon on the Mount is a call to action. There's a quality to it where there's an invitation, then there's an appointment, and then a directive that points its reader or its listener to who are they to become. And so, and I think that's important to think about that, to be aware of that this points to who we are to become. Because it's easy to read, it's easy to read some of these things and see these ideals, these Christian ideals, and think, man, this is too much for me. I mean, I might be able to check a couple of these boxes, but I don't know that I can check all of these boxes. God never said that when Jesus sat down and presented that sermon, he didn't say, listen, just take from this what you will. Some of it may not be for you. He didn't say that. He never preached that way. Anything that he conveyed about the kingdom, about God's standard, was always a call and a charge to everyone. This is for you. This must be a part of your life. So because it is a challenge, it is a call. It's both a sermon that he preaches that draws the listener in because they're hearing things they haven't heard before, but it's also a sermon that stretches their thinking. It stretches their worldviews. And really it confronts them in their faith wherever they're at in their faith journey. Now, for those of us familiar with it, we can understand, if you've read it, if you've heard it, if you're familiar with it, you can understand why it's a bit stretching, why it's a bit challenging, why it's a bit of a confronting message. You may not know that it had that effect on its listeners too. It's not just something that confronts us and challenges our faith, but it also had that effect on its listeners. You see, his audience, disciples, and then others who gathered along the way, all they'd ever learned from their religious leaders, their other rabbis and other religious leaders who had influence in their lives up to that point concerning the kingdom of heaven, was that it was something that they were to pursue externally through their obedience. So they were aware, the Jews, they were aware of all the legal ramifications behind their faith, that they were to follow and abide and obey these different laws, these rules, these regulations. And so their perception and their understanding of pursuing the kingdom life, was obedience to those things. And if they could do so faithfully, if they could obey faithfully and live these disciplines, these practices, these rituals, these mile markers out, if they could live them out, they'd be living the kingdom life. Now, the Romans also had their own version. They weren't necessarily trying to live the kingdom life of the one and only God. They had their own belief system, but they had a version of striving for a kingdom life too. And for them, it was secured through power and influence and wealth. So his listeners, their background and their experience with that kind of messaging was different. And so this was something that they weren't familiar with. You see, they weren't taught a great deal about internal conditions, the internal condition of their faith, where they were at inside, which is what the Sermon on the Mount is all about. It starts from inside. Jesus always preached a message and pointed to a reality that, man, it starts in here with him. It starts in that place where our character flows from, where our values and our morals, our foundational ideals lie. The others are really secondary. Now, something to know about that word kingdom. When we see that word kingdom used in the New Testament, it's rarely in reference to a material kingdom. It's usually in reference to a spiritual reality, a spiritual kingdom. So less often it's talking about buildings, walls, borders, military might and strength, which is what the disciples were hoping it was talking about. If you heard the Gospels enough, if you paid attention to the Gospels enough, you know that the disciples, they hoped that it was a conquering king that Jesus was, that he represented a conquering king and not one that was bringing these love ideas and all this mushy stuff, right? They wanted him to come and overthrow Rome and assume his rightful place as the Messiah on an earthly throne as a conquering earthly king. But kingdom has more to do with God's sovereign reign over all creation. A king's reign, that our present spiritual reality, we should actually be able to connect with it. Because God's reign, God's kingdom is our present spiritual reality. And it should make sense by simply looking back at your own life, looking back at the lives of those you know who you've seen encounter Jesus and whose lives you've seen change. You know the way that God has led you. You've seen his hand at certain parts in your, certain points in your life. It's a hindsight reality it's really cool to be a Christian, dialed into God, and be able to have those hindsight moments, right? When you're going through life and you're not always sure if God is leading you somewhere, if he's doing something through your life or just within your life, and then you're able to look back hindsight and see, God was there, and I don't know how I didn't see it, or maybe I did, I don't know why I denied it, but I see it now, God was there. And you have friends who are able to testify the same, are able to communicate the same messaging, and not just seeing God in your life, but then you, in his handprint or his fingerprint or just his involvement, but then seeing the difference that he's made in you, seeing the difference that he's made in people that you've known. I mean, I think we all probably know at least one person who we thought, man, that guy, that gal, there's no way God's going to get to that person. They're too far gone. They're too stubborn. They're too stuck in what they believe and ultimately what they don't believe. It's too foundational. But somehow God got through. And that's evidence of his kingdom. That's evidence of a spiritual reality, a spiritual kingdom that's present today. I shared with them this morning. I wasn't going to share, but then I decided to, so I have to share now with you guys. And I want to just share it because I believe it's an example of God's kingdom and the way that God works. And so this past week, I was in Cedar Falls, and I was driving back from Cedar Falls, and I wanted to get a coffee. And as you guys all know, who have lived here any amount of time, coffee shops are all over the place. Nobody's laughing. They're not, but every town has one, right? Every town, although Wellsburg doesn't have one. I just heard they don't have one. Sorry, Wellsburg. You guys got to go to other towns. But most of the towns have one, and you guys have great coffee shops, by the way. But I was driving back, and so I'm looking on the map, coffee, where am I going to go? And Dyke is the place I'm going to go. All right, that was the one that was next in line. So I'm going to go to Dyke. I haven't been to that coffee shop. I pulled in, got my coffee. What I need to include is that up to that point, anybody who knows me knows, man, I am deeply committed. It's a strong conviction and burden in my life that when I preach to God's people, I better be bringing something that God gave me, not something I came up with. And so there's times where I'm preparing and I'm like, man, is this just you? Is this just a good idea that I came up with? I mean, there's been times where I came up with good ideas and I was preparing the message and there was just nothing in it for me emotionally. There was nothing emotionally, intimately, there was nothing in it. The idea was good, but I realized, this is just me trying to wrap a message around an idea that I got. And so I start all over. It's got to be from God. It's got to be from God. And so this is something I'm deeply passionate about. And so with this series that we went through in talking about the abundant life, there was moments in that series where I thought, man, is this just redundant now? Or is the church tired? They're just being nice. You're the new pastor, so they're being kind and they're not telling you the truth. That this is too much about the abundant life. Can we move on to something different? And so I had moments like that. And I do this, listen, I'll do this till I'm 70 or 95. 95. I don't want to timestamp my life at 70. Okay, I want to go beyond that. Sorry, honey. 95. But I just rabbit trailed and I lost my train of thought. But I was just kind of processing this with God in the past probably week and a half, 2 weeks maybe, just thinking about it. Maybe I should move on. And I just wasn't sure. And God knows because I even took it to him, but he knew what I was kind of processing and working through. So I went to this coffee shop and got my coffee, went out to my truck, sat down, and I went to take my first drink. And the first thing I saw was that at the bottom of the cup. It says John 10:10. That's the theme verse for the series. Now, some of you might be thinking, oh, there's another Christian trying to spiritualize something normal, right? Maybe. But I believe that God was affirming. He was confirming that I had been on the right track, that it was him. Because that's how God works. See, sometimes we look for these miraculous, wondrous, amazing, remarkable things. And listen, God, bring them my way. I would welcome those. But you know what? I love these little moments. I call these little fingerprint moments. It's God's fingerprint right in my cup there. Yeah, that was what you've been processing, what you've been working through, what you've been camping out in, man. Ariel, you were on the right track. That was for me. So I just want to say that to encourage you, because that is the kingdom moment that I had, where God reminds me that he's in control, where he reminded me that I'm operating within the kingdom life, the life that he has called me to live. So when you have those moments, don't dismiss them, because that's what the enemy is going to do. You guys know that? The enemy's going to try to steal all those moments from you. You have a moment with God, he's going to try to steal it, and that wasn't God. That was just you. That's just coincidence that you were thinking about that very thing, and then this happens. It's just coincidence. That's what the enemy does. So we know it's present because we pay attention to those moments. You know, even our willingness to submit to his word is evidence of his kingdom. Our willingness to submit to this, our willingness to spend hours in this, our willingness to long for this and dive into this and want to know it more, want to understand it better, want to line our life up according to this word. That's evidence of his kingdom, because I never picked up any other book that I'm like, I'm going to wrap my entire life around this book. I feel compelled to. Now, I've read some good inspirational books. We all probably have. Like, I wouldn't mind making this a part of my life, being more disciplined in this area, better steward in this area, something like that. But it's evidence of God's kingdom. It's a spiritual reality. It's a spiritual kingdom. I'm going to read from Matthew's gospel. We already heard in our bumper this morning the sermon on the Beatitudes. And so I'm going to read through the Beatitudes just to kind of get us back into this is what we're talking about this morning, and actually we'll be talking about it next Sunday as well. The Sermon on the Mount, for those of you who don't know, you didn't maybe see it on the slide, it's found in Matthew, okay, the Gospel of Matthew, chapters 5 through 7. It's also in Luke, a more condensed version, but the one that's most well known, the one that people generally spend their time in, is the Matthew version of the Sermon on the Mount. Now, chapter 5 begins with Jesus, seeing the crowds, he went up on the mountain, and when he sat down, his disciples came to him. And he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revel you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you." That's the Beatitudes. A lot of blessed statements. So we read there in the first verse that Jesus sees the crowds and he begins to position himself to present his discourse, to present his sermon. So when he sat down, his disciples came to him. So he saw the crowds, he saw his disciples, but he saw the crowds and he decided, I've got to get to an elevated point. I've got to go position myself at an elevated point in which I can share what I have for them today. Now, important things happening on mountains is not new in the Bible. All right? Important things happening, taking place on mountaintops is not a new thing in the Bible. It wasn't new to his audience. They were aware of a number of things, a great number. Those who were really dialed into the Word of God were and had heard the stories through their upbringings and whatnot. They were aware that a lot of things have happened on mountains. Mount Ararat, we know that's where the ark landed. It's kind of a big deal. Mount Sinai, that's where Moses received the 10 Commandments twice. Mount Nebo, that's where Moses stood. That was the mountain that he stood on that was before the promised land, positioned before the promised land. And he stood there and he looked upon the promised land and saw where he would never go, where he would never enter. But that's where Moses stood. But it's also where Moses laid to rest. That's where he died. Mount Moriah is the mountain that Abraham took Isaac up onto, where they trekked that mountain so that Abraham could kind of become the father of our faith as he offered up Isaac to be sacrificed. There's a Mount of Olives. This is where Jesus prayed before his crucifixion, but it's also the mountain that he ascended from when he rose and walked amongst the people again for another 40 days and 40 nights, and then he ascended back to heaven. That was from Mount Moriah. The Mount of Olives. And here we're seeing another important mountain moment is about to take place as Jesus positions himself on the Mount of Beatitudes. Now, this Mount of Beatitudes is actually believed to be on a hill that's named Mount Eremos. And there's a couple of pictures that you see of what it probably looked like from the point that he preached and what his audience saw. But it's overlooking the Sea of Galilee in northern Israel. And this is what is, now we don't know the exact spot that he preached from, but this is the geography of where he preached. So here we see Jesus. He knows what he's doing. He decides to go position himself at an elevated point, and then he sits down. Now, and readies himself to teach. Now, this also wasn't something that was unfamiliar to his audience. Sitting down, the rabbi sitting down to teach was something that they were familiar with, but it was more than just simply him sitting down. Oh, he's going to sit down and say something maybe short, something brief. No, he sat down. They knew that he had something important to say. In verse 2, we see that he opened his mouth and taught them. It's interesting that there's also meaning in that statement. That's a saying in the Greek. He opened his mouth and taught is a saying in the Greek. And it was a saying that would draw attention to the fact that they were about to hear something significant, something meaningful, something central. And so his audience, knowing, being familiar, this being in their background, they knew that, man, he not only has he positioned himself somewhere, but he's sitting down. He's getting ready to teach something that's important. Jesus was about to offer them a prescription. Some call it a kingdom constitution. But that prescription was not for how they should live in order to get somewhere. Do this in order to get there. Because, see, that would have been familiar to them, being those who saw the kingdom as a life based on their obedience to rules and regulations. That would have made sense to them, but he wasn't there to teach them how they should live in order to get somewhere, but how they should live before they get there. So it's already a foregone conclusion. They're headed there, but this is how you should live until you get there. Really what they should become before they get there. So what we read in verses 3 through 11 and what we just read are the Beatitudes. Now in Latin, the word for that is beatus, and that means blessed, but in Greek it's makairos, and it's also meaning blessed. So these Beatitudes are 9. They're 9 moral statements that we just read that really detail what the blessed life looks like. This is what the blessed life looks like. And it's not a best case scenario life. So don't hear it that way. Don't read it that way. It's not this is what's possible. If you work hard enough, if you believe hard enough, this is what's possible. But these are 9 becoming statements revealing to us the life that we have entered into. So if your walk with the Lord is sincere, if your faith in him and your confidence in him is sincere, these will become a part of your life. One commentator said about the Beatitudes, their greatness is that they are not wistful glimpses of some future beauty. They are not even golden promises of some distant glory. They are triumphant shouts of bliss for a permanent joy that nothing in the world can ever take away. Which means they're a permanent joy. They are an experience meant for now. Not something to simply be hoped for. And now we get to my first point. My first point is our attitude towards ourselves, and that's going to be verse 3. Just like this morning, we'll have to finish up this message actually next Sunday, but I do want to breeze through the first point, so just bear with me. Verse 3, we read, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Now that poor in spirit, don't be weary of that statement. He's not saying broke in life, poor in your finances, not able to have anything you want. Oftentimes we hear certain things in the scriptures and that's how we interpret it. That's how we take it in. I'm poor in spirit. I have to be broke and living off rations. I think this first beatitude is probably the most honest of the 9. You see, this beatitude, it calls us to a posture of humility. It calls us to a posture of self-honesty that's almost unfamiliar in this day and age. In a day and age when we're rarely seeing those kind of attributes in people. What we're seeing is a world that almost entirely lures our focus towards like self-affirming, self-grandizing, self-praising ideas, believing that you are the greatest thing ever created. And don't think anything different. You can do anything. You can do anything and everything that you could ever imagine. It's the kind of world we live in. Jesus is bringing a different message. Jesus is saying that blessed is the person who has realized their own helplessness. The blessed is the person who has put the entirety of their trust in something other than themselves, God. That yourself is not enough. You see, I think too often our attitude towards ourselves is one that says, I'm capable of a great deal. I just need a little bit of help from him. So you go to him for a moment, a little bit of help from him, but I can do it from there. So it goes right back to us, back to self. I'll get me there with just a little bit of his help. When the attitude that he's looking for is the attitude of a pauper. A pauper is someone who realizes that they can't. They don't have it in them. They're not enough. They can't save themselves. They're helpless without him. That they're entirely bankrupt of any ability to save themselves and do it for themselves. You see, that attitude sees the world's value systems for what they really are. That they're temporal. The world's value systems can't offer us lasting peace. They can't offer us real joy, and they certainly can't secure our eternity. See, when that's the condition of our hearts, it is then that we're positioned to walk in the kingdom life that he has called us to. And Jacob was that. And we're going to end with this passage. We have communion still to partake of together. We'll go on to point 2 next Sunday. But I want to end with this passage, Genesis 32. Jacob, I am not worthy. We see the pauper in him right there coming out. He's humble. He realizes that he himself is not worthy alone. I am not worthy of the least of all the deeds of steadfast love and all the faithfulness that you have shown to your servant. For with only my staff I crossed this Jordan. Now I have become 2 camps. Please deliver me. Again, this pauper moment, deliver me. He sees that he can't save himself. He can't rescue himself from this situation. From the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, that he may come and attack me. My mother's with the children. But you said, I will surely do you good and make your offspring as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. See, his trust is entirely in God. Again, the attitude of a pauper living in a spiritual kingdom, aware of a spiritual reality. His attitude was of someone who is entirely reliant on God. Amen? How do we get there? How do we get there? You know, there's little things we do to get there. One of those things is communion. If I can invite the deacons up.